Before I begin my formal paper, though, I would like to mention a cartographer who had a major impact on my career. And some of you may have heard of him or even met him, and probably many of you have seen his books or familiar with his books on the history of cartography. And it isn't usual to dedicate a paper presentation, but I would like to dedicate my paper today to Norman Thrower, who will celebrate his 99th birthday in 4 days. And so this is for Norman. Okay, today I'm going to be talking about 3 women who worked in cartography in the 1940s. None of these women will be found in histories of cartography. None of them did significant work in cartographic research. None of them were big names in the field, but all were involved in one of the most important cartographic efforts of the 20th century. They form an academic family tree. On December 17th, 1941, 10 days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt made a pronouncement authorizing a mapping project. The maps available at this time for crucial areas were woefully inadequate, to say the least. Some of the maps of the Pacific area were 19th century French maps, hardly suitable for a modern war with submarines and aircraft. The coverage that we did have of maps was of concern because what maps existed were scattered in many collections. And we'd been concerned with this even before the war began and before it was declared, because there was fear that the United States would be unprepared, and sure enough, we were. As a result, Roosevelt signed this bill providing for an additional appropriation to the Army for the national defense effort. The bill included funds for expediting the completion of needed mapping in areas that the Army deemed as strategic. The Army Map Service, which was the forerunner of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, was established in 1942 and given 4 tasks. First, to collect and catalog and store foreign and domestic maps and map information that might be required for the War Department. Second, to furnish such map services as required by the General Staff and other authorized agencies. And third, to compile and reproduce maps required for initial operations for these agencies. And finally, this is awkward, to develop and improve mapping and map reproduction methods with particular emphasis on those most suitable for use in the theaters of operation. Training programs in military map making, usually called the 3M classes, were established at 22 colleges. They were primarily coeducational and women's colleges throughout the East and the Midwest. College catalogs during this time often had a statement about the war work that was being done at a university. The ESMWT, Engineering, Science, Management, Wartime Training Program. Does that sound to anybody like STEM? Okay. This program was put into place at many universities, and the 3M classes were often considered a part of that program. The person put in charge of the 3M program was Edith Putnam Parker, who was an associate professor of geography at the University of Chicago at the time. Parker's teaching emphasis was on geography in education. She was not considered a cartographer. In fact, Henry Lippard was the cartographer at Chicago at the beginning of the war. And I have no idea why he wasn't chosen, but I think it was because she was a woman. Parker had a PhD and an MA degree and originally taught at the university's laboratory school from 1913 to 1921. She was a textbook author and a map editor, and she authored with Harlan Barrows, another professor at the University of Chicago, a series of school geography textbooks. But she also wrote articles on map reading, and she was a consulting editor for Weber Costello, who was a big maker of maps and globes. Her duties as the director of the 3M program included selecting the colleges where the courses would be offered and preparing the instructional materials. Not surprisingly, many of the colleges had ties to Chicago, including Wellesley, Women's College time, where her sister, Margaret Terrell Parker, and also a woman named Elizabeth Eisen, both of whom had PhDs from Chicago, were teaching. The 3M program was a 60-hour program, but was augmented by courses at the Army Map Service, a 4-week course there, in addition to the 60 hours at the colleges. Okay. And this is another of Parker's books. And here are the 22 colleges that had the 3M programs. Okay. One of the major ones was Kent State University in Ohio, which at that time was still considered a normal school. The instructor at Kent State for the map-making course, which was not titled cartography, it was titled map-making, was Edna Eisen. Again, not a big name in the field today. Edna had a PhD and an MS in geography at Chicago. She was hired at Kent in 1935, and Miss Parker wrote a glowing letter of recommendation for her. At the time, the geography department had 3 faculty members, only one of whom had a PhD. It was not Edna. And she was the only woman in the department. And this is Edna around the time she was hired. There were no cartography classes listed in the catalog for Kent State at the time that Edna was hired. In fact, they didn't show up until around 1943. Her emphasis was, like Miss Parker's, geographic education. She was training teachers. This was common at normal schools. She wasn't uninformed in cartography and related fields, however. She had written books and articles that dealt with cartographic subjects. And this book, Our Country from the Air, is one of the earliest geography books that features air photos and their interpretation, and she wrote it in 1937. And at that time, course descriptions for field classes also talked about map making in the field, and she did teach some field classes. She wrote children's books on geography. Here she is with some globes. And she was also a consultant for the Cram company that made globes and maps. She didn't get a PhD until 1948, after the war. She kept taking summer leave to work on her degree and finally managed to complete it at Chicago in 1948. She did the maps for her dissertation, so she was capable of doing maps. And I know to most of you that this is not the best looking map you've ever seen, but it was pretty typical for 1948. Okay? She was only the 9th woman to get a PhD from Chicago. In 1943, she began teaching the map-making course at Kent, and that course emphasized the making of military maps. Okay? And as a part of her work on it, this is Edna teaching a group of girls. As a part of her work with the 3M course, she went to Washington to visit the Army Map Service plant in 1943. Yeah. And there were a total of 49 students from Kent State who were sent to the Army Map Service, and 21 of them, surprisingly, remained in government service after the war. It, in fact, ranked first in schools with the highest percentage of its cartographers retaining positions. By the 1946-47 year, after the war, Kent actually had a sophomore course in map reading, there hadn't been one before, and a graduate course, which was now titled Cartography, and both of those were taught by Eisen after the war. In 1943, when Eisen had started this course, she suggested to a student named Bea Shaheen, and this is Bea here, that she should take the map making course because she'd be able to get a good job after she graduated with the Army Map Service. Bea at that time was majoring in geography and elementary education. She planned on becoming a teacher. She kept a scrapbook, which is in the holdings at Kent State. And it is an absolutely wonderful look at life of a co-ed in 1940s. It had dried corsages, notes about sorority events, and swimsuit pictures of girls who were vying to become Miss Kent State. Things have changed a little bit. Bea took Eisen's advice, and she went to Washington, D.C., where she was listed initially as a drafter. The women there were originally called the Military Map-Making Girls, or the 3M Girls, or sometimes the Military Map-Making Maidens. Now, I'm sure that every woman in this audience is cringing at that title, but according to Bea, they actually liked it. They thought it was kind of cute, and it gave them recognition that they were somebody and they were important. Ultimately, there were around 200 3M girls. The women worked at what was called the base plant, which was about 7 miles from downtown Washington, and they were housed in an 8-building complex that was segregated into units for men, for women, and for married couples. They provided social events for the girls, including dances and softball games, to ease the stress of the job because they were not near the metropolitan recreation facilities. They worked for 3 years in a camouflaged building with day and night shifts. Frequently, they'd work for 70 hours a week. The jobs they did included map design, photo interpretation, photo mapping, drafting, and editing. In some cases, the work was top secret, as you might guess. And they didn't always know much about what their work was going to be used for. Bea's group, for instance, was working on maps for the D-Day invasion, but they didn't know that, not at the time, only that the work was really important. During the period from 1943 to 45, the AMS prepared, and these are just some incredible statistics, over 9,000 maps per year for the production. And in 1945, they reproduced 184,784,937 maps. Of course, these were not all the products of the 3M girls. There were some others. But between the period of 1940 to 1943, the number of civilian employees rose from about 100 to 3,500, and 55% of those employees were women. By 1945, the percentage was 58%. Now, although Bea began as a drafter, after a few months, she was made a coordinator at the AMS, and she would make speaking trips to places. And by the end of the war, she had been made assistant to the head of the project drafting department. At the end of the war, a few women remained. We mentioned those for Kent. They weren't all women that remained, but few remained with the AMS. But the majority returned home, having had the satisfaction of helping with the war effort. Bea was one who returned. She taught for about 10 years, married, and became Bea McPherson. However, her ties with the AMS remained. She had kept in touch with some of the women and was able to stage a 25-year reunion in 1968. There were about 30 who attended, and they were given basically the royal tour of what was, at that time, the Defense Mapping Agency. And in 1976, in honor of the country's bicentennial, she organized another reunion and attempted to contact all 200 of the former 3M girls. She created a list of the women and their colleges for the project, which is enormous help to me in my work. As I said at the beginning, none of these women were known as cartographers, but they did play a significant role in cartography during World War II and were given some recognition for their efforts. Miss Parker received a letter in 1943 from Colonel W.A. Johnson, who was at that time the head of the Corps of Engineers. I won't read it all in the interest of time. But suffice it to say, he was praising her. Edna Eisen also received thanks from the Army, praise from the Army Map Service for Kent State University for its work. And she was sent a letter by Colonel Robert C. Miller, who was the chief of the administrative section. And another honor, in 1963, 2 years after Parker's death and 3 years after Eisen's death, the Society of Women Geographers awarded a fellowship in the name of Parker and Eisen. It was apparently a one-year deal. Finally, in 1916, speaking of honors here, Bea McPherson was, at age 95, invited to Washington, D.C. to be inducted in the NGA, what the Army Map Service is now, the Hall of Fame as a representative member of the military mapping maids. She had been featured in articles on the AMS by the NGA, and she's also been listed as a notable alumnus of Kent State, and they have had articles in their papers. And so Bea is this gal right here. And finally, Bea then is the face of the military mapping maids. And a thank you here, and a thank you to you.